So good morning. My name is Donelan. I'm currently with Cisco Systems. When Hurricane Katrina struck, I was still with SBC. However, I was asked to moderate this panel. So one of our presenters couldn't be here from Bellsouth, Dave. So I just wanted to go over a couple of Dave's slides. You have his full presentation online, I believe. But Dave mentioned some of the things that Bellsouth learned. The last two slides in the presentation are his lessons learned. That Bellsouth has a lot of experience with hurricanes of all the ILECs in the country. And this was the first hurricane where they've actually lost central offices in 100 plus years of hurricanes. So even my point there is regardless of how good you think your disaster recovery is and how strong you think you build your central offices and so forth, if you get a direct hit, you're going to get a direct hit. And a lot of people talk how they weren't affected by something, but quite often they weren't the ones who got the direct hit. And next time, they may be the ones who get the direct hit. And it's more important how you recover, not whether you got hit in the first place. So some of the lessons Bellsouth learned was that Bellsouth, like most network providers, we kind of know what our customers are doing, but we really don't know how our customers are using our networks. And all of our customers use our networks for much, much more than we ever imagined. And although folks like to think of the internet as best effort unreliable, people are using the internet these days for very critical services. So the industry, ISPs, ILECs, cable companies, whatever communications company you are now a part of the first responder system. In any disaster, if there aren't communications, rumors and lack of information and the fog of war, so to speak, makes any disaster you have worse than if you had communications and you could get that information to the critical first responders. The other thing that Bellsouth learned is that as the disaster progresses and lasts a long time, most natural disasters are pretty quick. We've been fairly lucky. But as they continue over several days and weeks, providing security for yourself becomes more and more of an issue. And often private sector has to provide their security for their things because the public security forces are, quite frankly, involved with more important things dealing with the overall crisis. And as industry, the Katrina report is coming out in Washington, D.C., and that's why some of our panelists couldn't be here today. But it is important. You have to understand how government works in order to be effective to work with government. Although I'm sure that all levels of government are going to be receiving some well-deserved bashing today in that report. In reality, it's our government and it's what we make of it. And we need to learn how government works and how we can work with the way they work to be effective. They have their priorities, you have your priorities. You need to make them align. So some of the things that Bellsouth learned is that they already had a lot of partnerships with state, other carriers, state officials, federal officials. But they also needed to reach out with other groups, both within the industry and across industries such as power companies. Because the power industry and the telecommunications industry are very intertwined. And it's very hard to do that on the fly. You need to establish those relationships ahead of time. So some of the federal links are up there, the Communications ISAC and the National Coordinating Center. During Hurricane Katrina, the FCC also had their national phone number available 24/7, and they were responding to emergency requests for coordination also. And last thing, There are a number of federal programs, although people think that things like the Government Emergency Telecommunications System, the Telecommunications Service Priority, and their Wireless Priority System gets TSP WPS. Those are not just for government folks. Even though ISPs are quote, unregulated, ISPs can also be involved in some of those programs. So if you believe that you have some critical customers as an ISP, even if you aren't a phone company or one of the other companies, you should look into those programs. And all those programs are available on the www.ncs.gov website. So next I'm going to ask Bobby Cates from NASA to give a few words on his experience.
Yeah, actually, mine's pretty short. Start with the successes that just to get a few networks to cooperate, you can really get a lot done. We supported the very first emergency responders that flew in after Katrina. We had network access, some disaster recovery web services. We even streamed video. We provided them a Monday Night Football video coverage every Monday night. That was pretty cool. That stuff actually worked real well. We had all the typical government facilities out there as well, the sat phones and such. And those worked well, but we actually had a chance to have them side by side in the same tents, and the commercial facilities were actually preferable. The quality on the voice over IP was better. Late in the disaster, the president flew in. Secret Service entourage actually took over the whole spectrum space for the satellite phones. So we had the military come in and using our commercial voice over IP phones. The bill for all the voice over IP phones, 30 some odd together, was less than just one satellite phone. So there's no comparison for quality of service or efficiency. I want to say that those phones actually we got those on a few hours notice from people like Bill Woodcock at Packet Clearinghouse. We got most of the service on like an hour's notice from different providers in the Bay Area, IP networks and others. So it wasn't some long established system that we just flipped a switch and turn on. It was basically, driving up to Berkeley and making calls on the cell phone. And we kind of got things up while there was a C5 warming up on a runway. And we got it loaded before it left. The other thing is that every disaster is kind of different. It's really tough to pre-plan everything. There's limitations, at least for the first responders going in. Typically they're going in on a Huey, and you're carrying whatever the payload master says you're carrying in on that load, and you don't know when the next delivery is going to be. So, I mean, you could have a whole data center built up and backup and delivered, and it's a different story. TSP was kind of interesting for Katrina. Again, I imagine every disaster is different, but at least for the higher bandwidth, higher price circuits, the OC12s and OC3s, we didn't see a lot of difference between the TSP listed recovery and the non-TSP listed. I imagine something more ubiquitous like a T1, there's probably a longer lag time for restoral, but I don't have data on that. And then the only other things are what people have talked about already, things like WiMAX and VoIP just really saved the day. And they're pretty easy to implement too, so I'm pretty confident we'll see more of that in the future. And that's really all I got.
Okay. Next we have Mr. Snowhorn from Terremark, Napa of the Americas. And although Hurricane Katrina didn't affect him, Florida so much, he has some Hurricane Wilma stories.
So I love all my ladies, Katrina and Wilma. We got nailed twice this year. Do you have my slides? But a couple things I want to talk about is actually what the Saffir-Simpson schedule is, or scales. People actually understand what hurricanes are. A lot of people don't realize the wind speed of a 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5. And nobody, I don't think here, realizes that we didn't get hit by a Cat 5 hurricane last year or the year before. There's only been 3 Cat 5 hurricanes in the last 100 years that have hit the continental United States. There was Andrew, which was a very small storm in '92, Camille in 1969, and the Miami hurricane in 1935. So it's pretty dramatic. Out of all the storms in the last 100 years, 131 of them have hit Florida. So we're just, my house is covered with screws all over for steel shutters and all the other good stuff that goes along with that. And we just live, eat, and breathe hurricanes, and have a garage filled with water and supplies and canned food, and just normal. Every season you have that. Lots of batteries and radios and all that good stuff. And it's really fun entertaining your kids without TV for a week. Yeah. You want the white cable? Or the black one? Leave it to Donelan to create a disaster. Okay, there we go. All right, so Saffir-Simpson's scale basically talks about the different ranges of hurricanes that can come through. Cat 1 through Cat 5. Cat 1 is 74 to 95 miles an hour. The important thing is wind and water and 4 to 5 foot storm surge. Usually you see that just right on the beach. No big deal. If I live in Florida, I don't even put up hurricane shutters. We kind of blow it off. You hope our window doesn't break. That was Sean's inserted slide. There you go. So Cat 2 is 96 to 110. You start to get a little more worried. I live a mile from the beach, so it's my house. I don't really worry about it. Maybe the beach people have to start kind of evacuating. They issue mandatory evacuations. The National Guard goes around, all that fun stuff. Cat 3, we start to really get nervous. We start flying our kids out of town or driving away, and there's huge lines of traffic. And that's actually what hit us in Florida this year with Wilma. Katrina hit us as a 1. The year before that, we were hit by 3 different hurricanes, a Cat 2, 3 range. So pretty dramatic. Mobile homes are gone, a lot more damage, a lot more storm surge. It starts washing over the buildings on the beach, and it gets pretty ugly. Cat 4, which is what hit as Katrina in Louisiana, it hit us as a 1, was a lot of damage, 13, 18-foot tidal surge. Now, the reason it was so bad in the storm surge in Louisiana is it was a Cat 5 right off the coast, right before it hit land. So the surge had already built up. So the surge was actually a Cat 5 plus surge, massive. But the winds are actually only Cat 4. So you can actually understand that wind level. Now, when you get to Cat 5, 155 mile an hour or greater. Now, just so everybody understands, Wilma, which was in October during NANOG, I was in Los Angeles. Everybody saw me kind of panicking and figuring out how I'm going to get home. Wilma, when it was going over the Yucatan, was almost 190 miles an hour. It's the lowest barometric pressure ever recorded in history. Pretty scary. Just damage everywhere, 18-foot plus tidal surges. You heard there's 50-foot numbers. That stuff does happen. And you have hundreds of tornadoes inside that storm, not just the wind and storm surge, but the tornadoes just start wiping out whole swaths of areas. So I thought this was a good slide to show how really lame last year was. You had over 30 storms in total, 27 named storms. It's really interesting because you have tropical depressions, which usually form up and they peter out. And nobody really worries about it. You get a little wind and rain. But to actually have 27 named storms hitting all over the place, and you can see a lot of those hit into the Gulf, and a lot of warm water this year. So this actually shows Katrina's track, and you can see Katrina formed right off the Bahamas. It's kind of a little problem we have in Florida. In this time of year, when Katrina actually formed, they formed right off the Bahamas and instantly hit us. So you pretty much drive home from work, get out your shutters, hang your shutters in an hour, button everything up, try and get all the furniture turned over or tied up or stored at home, for example, and you run into the house and the hurricane hits 2 hours later. So it's really fast when it comes in this way. So that's how we had to deal with it in South Florida. And the problem we had is nobody was really ready and everybody blew it off as a 1. But it happened to just knock down a lot of trees. The winds were pretty intense. We had a lot of vortexes and it took down a lot of power lines. So hence we had a long amount of outage. But you can see as it tracked up, the really darker colors was a Cat 5 in the Gulf, and that just built up the waves and the surge, and it pushed that water into Louisiana, even though it hit as a Cat 4 when it got in there. I got to do animation. This was so exciting. It took me 2 hours to figure out how to put this into a PowerPoint. So this is actually Wilma going over, and right where the eye goes over is my house. I'm going to whine about that for a little while here. I was lucky enough to be at NANOG in Los Angeles when this was hitting, but I was watching this on radar. I was running around showing everybody and freaking out about how to get a flight home. I had to have shutters up on my house actually before I left, so I was lucky enough that I'd done that because I saw this storm coming and it was so big, it was just kind of worried. My wife and kids were out of town. But devastating damage just to my own home. Now, when we take it back to the NAP, we had to face a lot of issues. We faced power issues and everything else from a hurricane perspective. We're designed around this. This was only a Cat 3 storm, and if you notice, the southern county where you see the little radar scatter, that's Miami-Dade County. But look how far north the storm was when the radar goes over. I can actually see the eye going up in Broward and Palm Beach County. Broward County probably get the worst of it. Miami-Dade had huge damage, COs down everywhere. All those fiber paths run north on the east and west coast, so it hit it from both sides, covers the entire state. I mean, there's no escaping it. You're just in it. Wasn't that cool animation, by the way? I will sell you the rights of how to do that now. So. So as I said, we had 27 named storms. We actually went into the Greek alphabet. We even had a Greek named storm over New Year's, forming in the Atlantic, and actually it went up, and I think it caused issues with Spain. It had a really strange track. As I said, no Cat 5 storms came in. It was Cat 4 when it hit Louisiana and Mississippi and Katrina, and Cat 3 when Wilma hit Florida. And again, Wilma had the lowest barometric pressure ever recorded in history. Let's hope to God that doesn't happen again in another year, and let's hope it doesn't sit over us like it did over the Yucatan. If that sits over an area for 2 days, and the amount of infrastructure we have as the United States in a Florida or Louisiana or Texas area, I mean, untold billions of damages, and I'm sure FEMA will respond in at least 2 weeks. So, so everybody knows that Terremark has big balls, right? What now?
Kids.
I'm going to talk about
This
that.
isn't the Weather Channel?
So at NODA we did have some damage. I'll talk about my balls first, and I'll talk about packets, which Randy will like. So we have the biggest issue we face at NODA. We're supposed to withstand 200-mile-an-hour wind loads on our curtain walls, the way the building's constructed in the roof, and the domes are actually supposed to withstand 250-mile-an-hour winds. Now, remember I said Cat 5 is 155. The strongest ever recorded in history is 190, and we're supposed to be able to go past that standard. I don't have a picture of it, but I have a wonderful little circle. We actually lost this ball, and it was a $500,000 ball. During this time frame, we actually had a power outage. Can we go to the next slide? Actually talking about power and how this affected packets and issues with people. Now, the NAP itself never actually lost genset power. We went on commercial power. During Katrina, we were out for 31 hours. We were just running on generators. The commercial grid was dirty. There were lines down everywhere. FPL was totally unprepared and did not expect this at all. A lot of COs went down. All the cell towers went down. You couldn't make a phone call after 2 days. People couldn't refuel. There was no way to get connectivity. Thankfully, my dial-up line worked. It was the only way I was able to get into anything. When it actually came through Wilma, we actually got back off the commercial grid and onto the commercial grid in 10 hours, but it was so dirty and had so many big spikes and harmonics that we actually stayed off of it for about 30 hours and ran on gensets. What got really interesting is that everybody else was out of power for about 10 days. Every business, every enterprise who uses telecom services, lots and lots of ghetto colos went down. Guys who just didn't have a lot of backup fuel, backup gensets, the cheaper places, they were out. Just kiss it goodbye. That was all the spammers, by the way. Everybody happy with that? Now, what was really the issues we had to face inside the NAP were actually truckloads of servers coming in. Everybody was out of business. Spammers, hosting guys, enterprises, government guys showing up with servers at the back door, banging on the back door. Security not want to let them in. We're in lockdown, right? Post-hurricane, heavy security. We actually had to have a sales guy there handwriting contracts and engineers upstairs installing all the racks and cages for people, bringing up power, getting connectivity, getting cross connects, getting carriers to give us responses to get LOA CFA and all this stuff to turn these people up, any ISP to throw cable over to get people turned up. So it actually signed over 40 companies to get them in there on emergency operations. We gave them an out so they could actually leave if they wanted to after, and some did, but it was definitely keeping all those businesses alive was the big issue. I only know of, let me talk about the fuel, by the way. About 2 or 3 days into it, I started receiving phone calls from all the undersea cable operators literally begging for fuel, begging. These guys only had 2 to 3 days of fuel. Now, an undersea cable, think about what that does. If you take out an undersea cable station, you cut off, essentially a whole country. If you start looking at all the undersea cables that come in there, we have 12 undersea cables in South Florida. You take out all those things, they start losing fuel, you cut off South America. So it was a lot of people coming together saying, I've got a fuel load coming, but I've got enough fuel. I'll send it to you. There was a big network of things. We had the Association of Contingency Planners all calling each other. There's a little circuit of people, and we were talking about how to get fuel back and forth to keep these things up so that South America could stay alive, so that all the operations could keep going. I only know of one carrier that actually fully lost a CO. I'm not going to name them, but they lost it up in North Miami. There was some postings around Nanog around the time of Wilma. And they were toast. Their CO went down, their roof peeled off, they got water inside, burned out switches, gear, routers, all kinds of stuff, and that was the end of that. So it caused the NAP itself didn't go down for them, but they actually lost connectivity going out. Next one. So again, talking about planning, most people were not ready for this. They didn't plan for DR. They didn't have anything ready. Most people didn't have any data backup or network redundancy. Most people aren't doing replication. It's really surprising now that people are coming to us saying help, 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 and trying to figure out DR solutions. There's big meetings down in South Florida all the time about it. Actually, replicating data is huge. Gigs and gigs and gigs of data, it's gone. What do? Your offices are blown out. All the windows are gone. All the servers are wet. You have no backups. The tapes are gone. Who knows? So that was a big issue. The biggest issue we see down in South Florida, and especially in the Tri-County region, is that power's gone and their offices are down and their families are at home. Nobody's going to work. Kiss it goodbye. No way you're going to get anybody to go to work. So they're worried about getting food and water. There's big lines. The FEMA trucks will start showing up. The grocery stores people are trying to get into to get all the food and water. It's a big issue. Everybody tries to work from home, which I did for a few days during Katrina. Wilma, I actually flew out of town. It was smart. But getting access to the system is a big issue. So using thin clients and other things like that are very important. And actually having an old phone. I've got a couple of wireless phones, some VoIP phones at my house, but I had an old phone stuff in a drawer, and I plugged it in, and I still had power on the phone line, low voltage, and I could make a phone call. It was so cool. Everything was out. There was no way. So I had dial-up. I logged in and was able to get in everything. So dial-up rocks. Everybody who got rid of those accounts is not smart. Basically what we do with the NAP, last little note here, we actually bring in a staff of 20 and go to lockdown and bring in food, cots, water. So our disaster recovery plan is to be able to survive for up to a month that way. We have that much food and water in place, all these refueling stuff that comes in and everything else, but we actually have that kind of a lockdown procedure. And that's it, guys.
So if you have questions, come on up to the mic. Otherwise, I'll ask a couple of questions here. With NASA, the packet question, what did your network traffic do as you were supporting emergency relief operations? Were you seeing lots of traffic from places that you hadn't planned for, or was it business as usual?
So the emergency response at NASA, of course, lost two centers, Dennis and Michoud, during Katrina, but the emergency response was more than just those facilities. We supported NCS and FEMA and DOD and basically anybody that was there. And it kind of brings up a question. One of the things that I'd like to see in the future, we had a KU band satellite link back, and depending on what the demands are, we can go up to a full transponder, which is only 45 meg. But at the point that everyone's plugged in directly into the satellite modem, then there's kind of no QoS, so everybody just has to be kind of good neighbors to each other. So that being said, NASA was actually, we were using less traffic on that satellite link than many of the other folks. And really, the biggest bandwidth hog was the video stream for the football games. The voice over IP, everything else was, the compression was very good, and we didn't have any issues.
Bill Norton?
I guess the first question was to Josh. Was there any impact by the loss of one of your balls? Or were these redundant and this was just an additional one, so you lost one level of redundancy?
As you know, I did have 3 balls. That ball actually was a little different. The 2 big ones are 16-meter C-band dishes, and the domes are huge. They're like 8 stories high. The picture doesn't really do it justice. What we actually did, and I think Ken is one of our guys actually in the room. He's actually up there when the hurricane was hitting. He was on hurricane duty and was actually into the small dome, which is a KU band dome, while it's falling apart around him, trying to get it up to azimuth so that the dish inside could actually survive. It was an 11-meter KU band dish. What happened is there's some thinner panels on that dome so that the KU signal can get through. It's a little bit different than the C signal. and one of those either got penetrated or ruptured, and then the entire thing just, like a buckyball because the structure collapsed in on top of Ken.
So that ball is really just a protective surrounding the dish.
Exactly, and the dish is fully mobile inside, so they got it up to 90 degrees. What's interesting, though, is that the dish actually got bashed around by the foam and debris hitting it. It's got some peeled up corners, and it performs better now. So,
I guess the real thing that I was hoping to hear from you guys, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this, is what are the lessons learned? What are we going to do better next time as a result of what we learned from these disasters?
I think one lesson learned is the rule of thumb previously had been that you could have a backup site within, or let's say 100 miles or further. And I think with a 250-mile swath of multiple hurricanes, you clearly need to have a backup center that's further away and more inland, because a lot of firms I talked with had backup centers in Houston, and then Houston had to evacuate for Rhea. So it was kind of that domino effect all over again. That's just one observation.
Actually, our lesson learned was more on the good side. We actually accomplished more than we had anticipated, and most of that's just knowing people like y'all. So, I mean, that's what we're doing, is just as we meet people at Beer and Gear or whatever, we kind of find out who's willing to volunteer services or support, and how we can incorporate them into the next one. And then we're just asking more than we have in the past.
Ours really had to do with people. We have we host the 911 systems and DOD and the county government, the police department, all that stuff's in there. So we worked really well with them in communicating and be able to get into them staff and allowing those people in. Global Crossing actually lost their offices, so they had to pop in our building. They moved all their staff in. It was just a lot of people helping. Our biggest thing is staff, though, making sure that our staff has communications, food, water, who needs help. If somebody else didn't have damage to their house, go up, help these people clean up their yard and all the trees, get the shutters down, get their families in order and all that stuff. It's really your people, the most important thing.
I guess I was just thinking more along the lines of the internet infrastructure. I mean, I agree with the first talk, the Verizon talk, about this intricate web of dependencies. And certainly if you run out of power, you can't run the central office gear. If you can, deal with that particular problem, what next is on the break horizon? What's going to break next that will prevent the internet from functioning properly or make it more difficult to recover once it does break? And I remember the picture of the bridge that was sliced into a bunch of different pieces. You can't get fire trucks across them, but also, more importantly to the internet crowd, is you have a lot of fiber that goes across those bridges that is now splintered in 30 different places, and you need to run new fiber across those bridges to get things back up. So those types of internet-focused lessons learned is what I was kind of looking for.
So my comment on that is the internet design is, of course, a semi-mesh, not a full mesh. And you have the bridge outage, and there were ISPs in New Orleans that did manage to stay up the entire time. I mean, if you were on the NANOG list, you saw some of those postings. And there were multiple ways out of New Orleans, and not all of them were disrupted throughout the incident. So the internet lesson is IP can reroute, but you got to give it something to reroute over. So, Chris.
So I had a couple of hopes with the presentation and the panel. One was that some more disaster recovery stuff would kind of be covered. I think that an interesting question might be for the panel folks is, and maybe Paula answered some of this as well, is how do organizations that have disaster recovery plans that include, like, I lost my hard drive, I lost my central server, how is the change when you say, I lost my whole office? My staff can go remote and work, but I have no office for them to get to. Do telecom providers have services for them for disaster recovery, sort of, remote access solutions, things like that? Were those used to any great effect here? And for the telecom providers themselves that actually have POPs local, I have to admit that I didn't ask anything that happened beyond the first day with our hub down there. But, were you able to keep, was it mostly able to keep all of the internet infrastructure up and running? I think is sort of Bill's question. and Sean's response. So, but
I heard about 6 questions. Let me answer the one I remember. One of the questions was, I guess, as a carrier, maybe what did Verizon or MCI do to help out? Maybe I misheard that, but we have a solution called Private IP, which is our MPLS solution. Typically, you may have frame relay or private line access, but we do have an alternate that's sold for backup involving VSAT access. And so whether customers had prepaid for that or now wanted that, we did have about 5 very large firms in Louisiana that called, and on an emergency priority basis, we were able to give them satellite access so they could keep their IP networks running. I don't think I have permission to say who those firms were, but they're quite large. MCI also had, like they call it the blue truck, and maybe it's now the Verizon red truck. We're not sure, but anyway, so it's basically an empty truck with a bunch of PCs. It rolls in, and I think FEMA or some government entity rented or reserved 3 of those. And I'm sure if we'd had 30, they would have taken them all. So that's some contribution that we were able to do. I'll let someone get some of the other questions.
An interesting thing that happened is Katrina hit, and it was much earlier in the year, and all the DR trailers for HP and IBM, or they actually bring in these mobile workgroup recovery units, they call it, where they recover the people. They were all in New Orleans and all over the place. So here we are down in South Florida after Wilma, and there's no trailers left, and there's no mobile switches, nothing left to bring down there. So it was a bit of a catastrophe from that perspective. So it proves that because you could have so many hurricanes in a single season, you need multiple backup switch, mobile switch trucks, backup worker recovery trucks, everything else. What we saw in South Florida is that everybody was shell shocked after the hurricane hit, after Wilma hit, and nobody expected it to be so big, and everybody kind of wandered around like lost for about 3 days, and then finally, POTS lines. I mean, I got to emphasize how important it is to have a POTS line. It's great to have your broadband connection, but if that's gone and the cable IP head end's gone or they're down, POTS lines are great. Really, it's incredible.
Okay. One last question, and I think we'll head out to break here.
Okay. I had a question. I think it's more for Verizon, but the others can feel free to answer as well. Call me the optimist, but I look at situations like this as an opportunity to, because the damage is so vast, you have an opportunity to sort of reevaluate how you're doing things and perhaps look at what you're doing that was legacy that you don't want to do anymore, that you can kind of use this as an opportunity to be shed of and put in new gear, new access types, things like moving from copper to fiber, for example. That's already sort of an objective of Verizon's, I think. Can you kind of talk to what discussions have been going on around that?
Yes. Now, let me be clear that Verizon, of course, is not the local exchange provider in pretty much any of these 3 hurricane areas. So that would be, unfortunately, heavily hitting Bellsouth.
Tampa.
Okay, Tampa.
Yeah, Tampa was you were nailed by Wilma.
Okay. So I would say, my observation, and maybe I'm not, the spokesperson on this, is that you have a huge capital plant infrastructure. So even though parts of it are destroyed, it's an economic decision of, to the point of we want to give people their dial tone back on an emergency basis, and they were literally stringing, wire or cable across trees and across front porches on a temporary basis, which I would feel sure if I went back and looked, they probably are still sitting there across trees and front porches. But so I think that decision of do we upgrade and what would that take and what kind of capital, I would sure like to see that happen. I just think when you're in the thick of a war zone, I don't know if those are the decisions are made, but maybe once the temporary thing is done, you can assess that, and I certainly would see that you would want to improve your capital plan to be leading edge or whatever.
So I'd like to thank the panelists. This was a bit of an emergency panel of its own. Last Friday we found out we were going to do this panel, and I think I appreciate all the panelists for being able to contribute and have their slides ready. And Steve Feldman will give us a few words before we go on to break here. Thank you again.